Alrighty, we are live on Riverside. Should be projecting out to LinkedIn. My friends on LinkedIn. Wait a little bit for people to start rolling in. But happy Monday to everybody. Obviously, if you're up in current events, the winter storm has now passed. We are still snowed in here in Texas. And quite frankly, I don't know if we'll survive. There's just so much going on in all of the half an inch of ice that we received that infrastructure might not be able to keep up. So pray for me. Continue to send care packages, gift cards, all of that is well received. My family appreciates it. All in jest. Of course, we're doing just fine. Family is great. We enjoyed a little snow in. I'm going to watch some football and have some ice cream, which sounds silly in that much cold. But needless to say, we can kick things off as people start to roll in. This is the Wired for More Performance Gap webinar. And part of the reason why I wanted to have this discussion is that I do ADHD coaching and performance coaching. And one of the things that's really interesting about studying the ADHD brain is that what we can learn from delivering on focus, follow through, easeful effort, intensity, and recovery for the ADHD experience, we can use to implement that same level of output, intensity, and focus and follow through without burnout. Being able to take what works for the ADHD brain and implement that in the neurotypical experience can actually increase the quality of your performance, the effectiveness and consistency in which you are creating that level of output, and your ability to follow through with the tasks that you say that you're going to implement. So, who am I? My name is Ian May. As I said, I'm an ADHD and performance coach. I've worked in the tech sales industry, software lifecycle consulting. I was an engineer turned sales rep. And in the 12 years of experience in industry and all that consulting work that I did, oftentimes we would have to implement systems and processes in order to increase the life cycle of the output, life cycle and process. And oftentimes software did not completely meet the needs. It wasn't just about putting another tool in place. It wasn't just about being able to put another system in place. It was also being able to navigate individuals, teams, and participating in the process that's necessary to create the output that you want. In those environments, oftentimes for me as a consultant, I was helping try to get buy-in from individuals for the processes that would actually lead to the output that they wanted. So what's interesting about this whole process of understanding this type of consulting is that this same level of implementation works for the ADHD brain. It's not just about being able to create another system. It's not about just having another planner, another calendar to manage your time more effectively. It is also about getting buy-in, getting your nervous system to participate in this. So over the last year, I've worked with about 200 ADHD executives, sales reps, some students who are working in industry and being a student at the same time, and being able to help them perform more consistently, continue to help their brains turn on in the right moments for the right things, to be able to experience what they're fully capable of and being able to get the output that we want. So why are we here? Enough about me. We're here because we've all likely experienced some amount of burnout where we are pushing ourselves, we're reaching more and more deadlines. Industry is continuing to push forward. AI is forcing us to have to move quicker, have to have shorter timelines for deliverables. And we're coming up against the gun on being able to wonder, hey, how can I keep pushing like this? I'm not sure that I can. And so what we want to be able to develop an understanding of is taking what lessons we can from this ADHD experience, where you're more likely to struggle with impulsivity, you're more likely to struggle with focus, you're more likely to struggle with some of these executive functions. The more we can learn about those things, the more we can implement them to understand how do we spot earlier signals for these downward spirals, overwhelm, being able to understand earlier signs of burnout, and then being able to really align ourselves to better understand three, I would say, major contributors to burnout that we can then start to assess in order to build our capacity for knowledge and awareness around what delivers on performance. So, a quick lesson in the ADHD brain, this is a little bit more on the neuroscience side of things, is that part of what we can define the ADHD experience as is this, in simplest terms, it's an adaptation of dopamine, norepinephrine, and blood flow to certain regions of the brain that essentially affect higher activity in the autonomic nervous system. So this is the part, the fight, flight, freeze, fawn part of the brain, as well as greater emotional experiences. So this heightened amount of blood flow, dopamine in these regions of the brain increase the feelings and intensity of that fight, flight, or response, can increase the experiences of our emotional experiences and emotional drives, and limits the blood flow to parts of our brain that are responsible for working memory, for planning, for time management, and for motivation. Which all sounds really awesome, doesn't it? This sounds amazing. Please give me all the ADHD, said no one. So I'm really selling it, aren't I? Really selling you on the joy and the beauty of the ADHD experience. Not likely. But here's the thing, is that the more we can understand what lights up the ADHD brain, the more we can start to understand how to utilize and implement it as a tool for higher levels of performance. Now, some of this is going to seem a little bit redundant in understanding what causes these levels of burnout, overwhelm, all these cycles that break down our ability to show up and perform for the things that matter most to us. So, one of the things that we can look at, I'm just very simply doing a quick recap of understanding what dopamine really is. Some interesting things about dopamine right now is that, as I'm pointing out here, we relate dopamine to sugar, we relate dopamine to drugs, we relate dopamine to all of these kind of hedonic pleasures. And what's interesting is that dopamine has actually kind of started to get a bad rap. And we should fast from dopamine. We should try to minimize dopamine as much as possible. We should all be monks and bored out of our minds constantly. But the thing about dopamine is that it isn't good or bad. There's no association with dopamine, whether it's good, bad, ugly, evil, pleasure seeking, hedonism. None of that is true. Dopamine itself is actually pretty fundamental to our human experience. It's fundamental to movement. It's fundamental to motivation, to decision making. I cannot move my finger without dopamine participating in my brain to perform that function. So what's interesting about dopamine, yes, dopamine does reinforce pleasure. Yes, dopamine predicts pleasure. What's interesting though is that dopamine also reinforces safety. Dopamine also reinforces and predicts safety. And so we have this kind of duality of dopamine participates a lot in motivation, but it is also very effective in being implemented for memory. And so when we have this, we have maps in our brain of all the places that we can experience safety, potential pleasure. In large part, our brain is utilizing dopamine to try to reinforce those patterns of safety. And anytime we are all of a sudden on one of those little maps and we're following the trail to safety and pleasure, our brain's now producing dopamine to mobilize and motivate us to move further along that path. So why is this useful? Is that oftentimes when we're getting into a state of extreme burnout, one of the biggest components of our behaviors, of our patterns, all of those behaviors that we're running into are coming from this emotional escape, are coming from this fear or lack of safety, psychological safety in this case. So what's interesting is that the amygdala, so this part of the brain that's regulating emotional experiences, is also participating in the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn experience. So what's interesting is that historically, the amygdala would be useful for us assessing danger, assessing the lions and tigers and bears behind the dark shadows, and helped us have this vigilance to survive, being able to determine where risks were actually coming from. Modern era, with modernity that we have now, much of our fears are more socially related. So a lot of these fears are for being seen for the wrong things, being seen with criticism, fear of rejection. So now all of a sudden, when we're running into scenarios where we're procrastinating or we're avoiding a task, and we just can't get ourselves to just start, it's usually some type of fear of criticism or rejection. Now, what's interesting about this is that procrastination or perfectionism is actually sort of this underlying theme of, oh, I'm just a perfectionist. So if I can't do it perfectly, I'm not going to do it. Well, what's actually the case is I feel so viscerally the negative criticism when I don't get it perfectly right. Now I can't start the task. Now I'm struggling to be able to even take one step in moving forward with it. Now, what's interesting about this is that the sooner we can start to name and give language to some of these experiences, these emotional experiences that cause these states of overwhelm, we can start to build habits and practices that notice it, regulate, calm us into a practice where we can actually be able to implement that first step. So one of the things that I think is the most interesting, especially now in kind of the corporate environment, what I'm seeing a lot more of when it comes to company culture, when it comes to culture warriors, forgive me for using that language, but I think it's pretty respective of industry, is that there's also one of these emotional escape mechanisms that's called counter will. This is like an act of rebellion. And so what rebellion looks like, or counter will looks like, is that even if I have somebody who is trying to be helpful, even if their advice that they're giving me is intended for good to help me, if I don't feel that that person is safe, then the things that they're saying don't feel safe. And so this counter will or rebellion that comes up is seen in our corporate culture of, well, the man, I have to stick it to the man, and the man wants to bring me down, and blaming corporate culture for my inability to show up. I saw this a lot in my own career as well. This is something that feels very viscerally in when you're in a meeting and as a sales rep presenting your quarterly business review, your numbers are a little bit low. You didn't quite hit the numbers from last quarter, or you don't have 3x pipeline to cover what's necessary to hit your goals for the current quarter. And now all of a sudden you're being faced with a ton of potential rejection, a ton of criticism, and being able to sit down and even build out your slides for that quarterly business review. It's not happening. You're waiting until the last minute. You're pushing it off as much as possible. That rejection is very real. But then the counter will or the rebellion is that when you're in that environment and somebody's giving you advice on what you should be doing, things that you could do to take action on, if you don't feel some level of psychological safety with that person, you're actually going to start rejecting the criticism that they have, even if it's healthy criticism, even if it's provided in a healthy way. If you're feeling a lack of safety in that environment, you're all of a sudden going to do the opposite or do nothing and blame the other person, blame your boss, toxic managers, but you not take responsibility for how you're showing up. This emotional escape mechanism is continuing to increase a good amount of that task avoidance. This is one of the most, I think, major experiences that causes burnout, is this emotional overwhelm, not being able to feel psychological safety within your team, with your managerial staff, people who are managing you, but also executive leadership. If you're feeling like executive leaders are not looking at the individuals on the team, not seeing the mental health of the team, and so now all of a sudden you're feeling this sense of rebellion happening, now you're all of a sudden not showing up to meetings the way that you should. Your forgetfulness is increasing. Your ability to take action on the action items that are expected of you. All of this stuff starts to create this cycle of overwhelm, the cycle of capacity being pushed further and further and further. And all of a sudden, where in years prior, you might have been able to show up and get to work and have that high level of performance that you expect of yourself, all of a sudden you're not able to show up in ways that are meaningful, and you're starting to have bigger misses quarter over quarter, have more deadlines being missed or pushed. And part of it is this emotional escape mechanism that's spiraling into really a place where you're not sure how to even pull yourself back out of it. This is a big component of that burnout. The sooner we can notice these emotional escape mechanisms and give language to them, the sooner that we can actually start taking action on them. All right. The next part of all of this is cognitive overload, right? This is honestly where I think most people aren't able to discern when we have these simple tasks that actually have a lot more complexity underlying them that aren't being addressed or aren't being acknowledged. So, with any simple task, one of the things that can cause a lot of overwhelm and for you to completely freeze is any number of components that actually make it more complex than it really seems at face value. Hey, you need to build your ICP. So for founding account executives and they're joining a really new startup, and it's like, hey, you just need to put a list of our ICP together. Well, you haven't fully proven out who the ICP is. You're feeling some overwhelm around who you're even identifying as being this ideal persona. You're feeling some overwhelm about not actually having a next action step. How do I prove an ICP if we haven't really sold to this ICP in the past? How do I prove these, the next action, building a list, building all of these components? Who am I identifying? How do I even go about finding them? What's their contact information? Being able to notice that there's no obvious next action step because I haven't broken it down into smaller steps required to perform the simple task. Oftentimes can be pretty straightforward. I can sit with ChatGPT and be able to say, hey, I'm trying to work on building a sales list. Help me break this down into smaller chunks. Great. I can work with somebody, I can work with my manager to be able to say, hey, I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed by this step that we have. Can we talk about like what smaller components make up this process? Great. That's awesome. I can make that happen. Pretty trivial in making those steps. More often than not, though, the issue is things keep changing. I'm being told that this is a priority and that this is a priority, and I also have to do this, and that's also a priority. And at no point am I being given the ability to set boundaries for what is my number one priority. Hey, that new task that you just assigned me, uh, right now, I have this priority and this priority. Help me understand. Where do I put this new thing? How many hours a week should I be expected to be putting towards this thing? Where am I going to be finding these additional hours? Because right now, these are the hours that I have allocated for this and allocated for that. And I can start putting those boundaries. But when I have competing priorities and shifting expectations, increase cognitive load. Now, all of a sudden, everything feels like it is the most important thing. Everything feels like I have to deliver on this. And oftentimes we can run into these issues of not having very clear communication patterns and boundaries that we can set that we can be able to share. And what's interesting about when we start to push back is you very much can find yourself in an environment where it's like, well, this is the job. Well, that's the expectation that we have for you. Anytime that we run into these scenarios where it's not clear what the motivations are supposed to be, hey, what are the expectations? What is the outcome of this? Because oftentimes the outcome is good job. You get to keep your job. That's not a clear motivation, right? There's always going to be this give and take. When you're in a healthy working environment, when you have healthy communication with your manager, you can be able to say, hey, here are the goals that I have within my role. Here is the next step that I'm trying to go reach. This is the promotion. Here's the salary band. Here are the things. Like, let's work backwards from there to be able to say, if I can hit this, this, and this is going to be the outcome. Agreed or disagreed? More often than not, when you find yourself stuck in these cognitive overload points of burnout, it is because you have not created very clear motivations for yourself, clear expectations for communication channels with your managers, and across the rest of the team. This cognitive overload is what can often make people feel completely stuck, not being able to start their next task because it's too complex. There's not clear motivation behind it. There's no clear boundaries around when expectations are going to change, how those deliverables are going to be changed, any number of things that cause this sense of overwhelm. So this is the second of the three that we'll talk about in this session. The final of them is honestly just physiological, right? Oftentimes when people are running into a state of burnout is that they are not feeling their body effectively. And this is across dopamine, this is across inflammation, this is across eating, diet, and nutrition aspects. And essentially you're chronically stressed. And so this chronic fatigue that comes from over pushing yourself and under recovering from the intensity of your output is causing significant amounts of inflammation, causing you to have an inability to actually recover dopamine back to baseline, being able to recover your energy and mental focus. The interesting thing about the physiological dysregulation is that this is usually something that creeps up over a longer time horizon. And the difficulty is that we create patterns where we're not getting enough rest, and then we're overusing stimulants, caffeine, ADHD medications, and essentially causing it to where our body is actually not even able to take more effective action on these higher levels of dopamine. Now, there's another component of dopamine, and it's called dopamine receptors. What's interesting about dopamine receptors is that over time, if we keep blasting crazy amounts of dopamine in our system, the dopamine receptors actually start to retreat. They start to pull back. And the analogy that I love the most for this is this gift. This is from I Love Lucy. And so Lucy and a friend are factory workers on this chocolate factory, right? They're supposed to be wrapping up these chocolates. The chocolates are the dopamine. Perfect analogy. Nailed it. And so as you can imagine, over time, Lucy, and I believe her name's Ethel, I apologize for any I Love Lucy fans. They're the factory workers, and these factory workers, they're the dopamine receptors. Their job is to actually receive and transport the dopamine to the next neuron and pass it on. But so because the dopamine just keeps getting blasted, and we're blasting it from stimulants, we're blasting it from screen time, we're blasting it from any number of things, from the sugar, from all the stuff. This is what people are talking about when they sort of crap all over dopamine, is the fact that when you're blasting so much of it all the time, the dopamine receptors, hey, these factory workers, they're going to go on strike eventually, right? They're going to retreat. They're going to be like, I've had enough. I cannot eat another chocolate off of this factory floor. This is what happens in your nervous system. And so the dopamine receptors, it's called down regulation, as they retreat, as they dissipate, what ends up happening is that if we're ever feeling low in dopamine, now all of a sudden we're feeling more of the dopamine surrounding our amygdala, around the emotional centers of the brain. And so this is a significant part of the ADHD experience, just due to the nature of the lack of dopamine to parts of the brain. But anybody can experience this level of dopamine downregulation, and oftentimes actually recreates the ADHD experience for the neurotypical experience. Anybody should be developing the habits and strategies to come up with better patterns for recovering dopamine receptors. Not just recovering dopamine, but recovering dopamine receptors. This is a little bit of a longer process. This is something that can take weeks, even. Being able to give your body more time to be able to recover more consistently. Now, what's interesting about this whole process is that oftentimes what happens in the ADHD experience, as well as even just the neurotypical experience, is we often have a lack of objectivity around how we're getting the dopamine in the first place. So how this works in the ADHD experience is that typically if we have more dopamine and blood flow in the emotional centers of the brain, and we're not getting enough dopamine and blood flow to the logic executive functions of the brain, frontal lobe and other outer regions of the brain, we need this big blast of dopamine to finally cross that chasm. Now, what's interesting is that our emotional center of the brain is now pushing us to be impulsive about how we're getting this dopamine. And then essentially how we're experiencing the dopamine, how we're getting it, how we're actually getting that big blast of dopamine to get it to reach the frontal lobe, to reach the executive function of the brain, is that now that part of our executive logic that now finally has the dopamine and the blood flow, it's going to look back on how it actually received that dopamine. And it's either going to have this big swing of judgment, shame, this feeling of shame that it's going to have around how it actually achieved and got that dopamine in the first place, which now all of a sudden makes the amygdala all the more active, all the more heightened, feeling this sense of isolation and, the tribalism of, hey, I'm going to be rejected because maybe this was immoral, or maybe it's something that just is outside of my values for how I achieve getting this dopamine. And so that's part of it. But if I don't have the emotional regulation skills, it's very likely the same thing that caused me to get that dopamine in the first place, that then now created the shame, turns back into this vicious cycle. And the other side of this might very well be, maybe it's not shame. that frontal lobe or that executive logic is creating. It's the opposite. It's justifying. Hey, I just need this to relax. Hey, this just helps me be able to perform a little bit better. And you can start to justify these habits, the nicotine, drinking during the workday, not saying no to a margarita during the lunch the lunch business meeting. All of those things that we can start to justify. Well, I need to have this drink because the client's having this drink. Oh, I'm gonna have this go hit a vape in between my calls because it helps light my brain up. We can start to justify the patterns and behaviors that cause us to be able to get that dopamine and blood flow to that frontal lobe. Over time, though, it becomes less and less effective. It turns more and more into addictions. And those patterns start to cause us to be much more emotionally dysregulated, much less able to recover healthy levels of dopamine on a daily basis, which now causes us to require more and more of those stimulating mechanisms to feel any level of normalcy in our nervous system. Not a good place to be. I can tell you from my personal experience, and where I got started in this work was for me 5 years ago, where I found myself stuck in patterns of addiction just like this. Now all of a sudden I'm not able to show up to work, even though I'm still hitting metrics and still being able to close close record deals within startup companies. I'm doing it from more and more burnout. So for me, one of my biggest moments of clarity was I had just closed the biggest deal in company history. I'm getting the trophy, I'm getting the accolades. And yet, what was required of me to get there in my nervous system was so far beyond what I was capable of recovering. The motivation wasn't there anymore. The anxiety was through the roof. The pressure to perform got way out of hand that this wasn't coming from a healthy place. There wasn't excitement in the work anymore. It was just constant stress all the time. And that led to addiction. That led to internet addiction, porn addiction, abusing alcohol, all number of things that I was really struggling with on the side. It really caused this to become more problematic and increased amount of burnout. Now, the beauty of all of this is that the difficulty we can have is we can start to look at this as being some level of character flaws. Start to shame ourselves for having gotten into these traps, having gotten to this place of burnout, having gotten to this place where I'm no longer able to show up for the work that I have in front of me. So what's interesting about this, though, is that as soon as we can start to see that there are skills we can build and develop to be able to decrease the shame, decrease those belief systems around character flaws, that I'm lazy, I'm undisciplined. And as soon as we lean into this idea of skill acquisition, the nice part is that skills can start small. Skills can be scaled over time. The biggest implementation that I found when I really had to sit with and create some objective reasoning about my behaviors and my patterns, that as soon as I could become emotionally neutral about them, just look at them from a place of skill acquisition, skill development, I could then start to create a program for being able to navigate all of these potential breakdowns, being able to increase emotional regulation and resilience, being able to increase objective reasoning about some of my dysregulated patterns, being able to increase my decision-making processes, being able to obsess about how do I make decisions? How do I implement strategies so that I am not constantly in a state of impulsivity, constantly in a state of trying to just claw my way through to appear normal, and instead being able to get to where I'm able to turn on energy, flow, excitement, intensity at will. The nice part about this is that all of this is possible. So after my biggest seasons of burnout, I was able to take a step back, leave that job, stayed within the same company, but moved into a different role that actually allowed a little bit more room for me to focus on myself, to spend more time understanding how my brain is working. During that 2-year period after that big moment, big state of burnout, kind of that, hey, I'm done. It has to stop. It has to change. I have to make this decision to change. I was able to start actually increasing my output, that I was able to work my corporate job. I was able to start volunteering for side projects, became a pastoral leader for an organization on the side, nonprofit, started to also implement and build out a coaching business on the side. So now all of a sudden I'm having more capacity for the work that's in front of me, that's paying the bills. I'm also continuing to see more accolades, more success, more output, while also building things on the side, while also being able to take my health under control again. I lost 40 pounds of fat over the course of a 2-year period because I was able to navigate all of the impulsivity, distractions, dysregulations, leaning into those skills. I was able to get myself out of $60,000 of debt, even after leaving my big paying sales job, that I was able to decrease my income by almost 40% and still be able to tackle this $60,000 of debt, because I was able to change my patterns and behaviors and develop these skills for more emotional regulation, setting healthier boundaries within my workplace, and being able to utilize dopamine more effectively for the things that I actually cared about. So these skills I'm going to be sharing in much more detail in a workshop that's happening this coming Wednesday, 3:00 US Central Time. It's a 2-hour workshop. So we're going to go really in depth with not just creating awareness of these problems, but what are the actual skills that you can develop in real time. So I'll show you practical skills in real time to regulate your your nervous system, and emotionally regulate in real time, but also being able to help you develop skills and essentially your workout plan to increase your emotional regulation skills. How can you develop those over time? How do you scale that? How do you build that without necessarily leaving everything behind and go being a monk in the Napoleon Mountains? Being able to develop more of those patterns that actually increase your resilience. The beauty of this whole process is that you will be able to start to take on more, which when you're in a complete state of burnout, that feels impossible. When you're in a state of chronic fatigue, when you're in this hypervigilance, always just feeling like you're just trying to get from one day to the next, big dreams and big visions seem outside of your realm of possibility. So all of this stuff is going to help you be able to take on more from a place of abundance, excitement, energy, and intensity. So if you're watching this, feel free to scan this QR code. Reach out to me if you have any questions. It's a $50 entry. It also gets you an integration one-on-one coaching session with me. So we'll be able to talk about your specific plan, as well as talk about what other integration tools you might need that are specific to your use case, and be able to join the other 200 people that I've worked with over the last year to help you implement these strategies in real time and be able to see the success that you're capable of. Being able to move further in less time with less burnout and just that feeling of depletion in your work. Thankful for you joining today. Thankful for you watching this. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, and I'll talk to you soon.